Hey there! Tonight, instead of revisiting the familiar faces of Olympus or walking alongside heroes whose names echo through every classroom, we're venturing somewhere quieter. Somewhere the spotlight never quite reaches. We're seeking out the gods who were forgotten, the deities whose temples crumbled into silence, whose names faded from prayers, and whose stories slipped through the fingers of time like sand. Not because they were weak or unimportant, but because history, like memory, is a selective thing. It keeps what it chooses and lets the rest drift into shadow. If this kind of gentle exploration into mythology's quieter corners helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you some peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all scattered across the world, settling into the same soft darkness together. So, find a comfortable position, let your shoulders drop, release whatever the day asked of you. We begin not with the gods themselves, but with the peculiar nature of forgetting, and why even the divine are not immune to it. Before we meet the deities who history misplaced, it's worth understanding how gods could be forgotten in the first place. After all, these weren't minor characters. They were worshipped, feared, honored with festivals and offerings. Temples were built in their names. Priests devoted entire lives to their service. And yet, empires fall. Languages change. Conquerors arrive with new gods tucked under their arms like imported goods, and gradually, imperceptibly, the old names begin to fade. The ancient world was not a single unified belief system. It was a patchwork of cultures, each with its own pantheon, its own sacred places, its own understanding of how the cosmos operated. When one civilization absorbed another, gods didn't always make the transition. Some were adopted enthusiastically. Others were merged with local deities until their original forms became unrecognizable. And some were simply left behind, like forgotten luggage in the terminal of history. Think of it this way. Imagine you're an ancient deity whose primary temple sits in a valley that happens to be in the path of an invading army. The army arrives, the temple burns, your priests scatter, and suddenly there's no one left to remember your hymns. Perhaps a few farmers still mutter your name when they plant seeds, but within a generation or two, even that stops. You haven't died. Exactly. Gods don't die the way mortals do. You've simply faded. Like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Religion in the ancient world was intensely local. Every spring had its nymph, every forest its spirit. But this intimacy made such deities vulnerable. When populations moved, when landscapes changed, these local gods found themselves without worshippers. Written records were scarce. Most religious practices were oral traditions. When that chain of memory broke, knowledge vanished completely. And so tonight, we wander through the archives of the almost lost, the deities who linger in fragments of pottery, half-eroded inscriptions, and the occasional footnote in ancient texts. Sabazios was once a significant figure, a Phrygian and Thracian deity associated with fertility and nature. His worship spread across Asia Minor and into Greece, where he was sometimes conflated with Dionysus, sometimes with Zeus, and sometimes allowed to remain himself. He was depicted as a horseman god with his hand raised in blessing. Small bronze votive hands have been found across the Mediterranean, decorated with pine cones, serpents, lizards, frogs, all creatures of fertility and transformation. Worshippers dedicated these hands at shrines, asking for Sabazios' favor. His rituals were ecstatic, involving music, dancing, and abandon that made conservative Greeks uncomfortable. Followers gathered in forests playing drums and flutes. There were mystery rites too, secretive ceremonies promising closer connection to the divine. Sabazios offered something traditional Greek gods did not: a personal, emotional connection. Olympian worship was transactional. Sabazios offered transformation, ecstasy, direct experience. But as Greek culture centralized, Sabazios found himself in an awkward position. Too foreign to be fully Greek, too rustic for urban tastes, too easily confused with other gods. His worship declined. Festivals grew smaller. Temples fell into disrepair. By the Roman period, he'd become a curiosity, remembered mostly in the countryside. Later writers mention him with vague interest. Then even those mentions stopped. He didn't vanish suddenly. He faded slowly, like a voice growing quieter until lost in ambient noise. Bendis had a better chance. She was a Thracian goddess, a huntress and moon deity whose worship reached Athens in the 5th century BCE. Unusual, since Athens wasn't welcoming to foreign gods. But Bendis arrived during war and uncertainty. Associated with Artemis but distinct, She wore a long chiton and Phrygian cap, carrying 2 spears. Her iconography was unmistakably foreign, part of her appeal. She represented something exotic, mysterious, different. Her followers celebrated with torch races and nighttime festivals. Plato mentions the Bendideia in the Republic, describing it as vibrant, drawing large crowds. The festival featured torch races on horseback, riders thundering through night with flames streaming behind. The Bendideia became an official state festival, which was remarkable. For a time, Bendis seemed secure. She had a temple, worshippers, state recognition. But as politics stabilized, as Thracian influence waned, Bendis lost her distinct identity. She was increasingly seen as just another form of Artemis. By the Hellenistic period, she was rarely mentioned. Her temple was repurposed. Her festivals disappeared. She lingered in Thrace somewhat longer, but even there, records grow sparse. In central Italy's mountains, among the Marsi people, there was Angisha, goddess of snakes, healing, and magic. Her domain was practical. She taught healing snake bites and preparing remedies. The Marsi were famous for serpent skills. They could handle venomous snakes fearlessly and cure deadly bites. Romans respected their abilities and hired them for serpent problems. But respect for skills doesn't mean respect for gods. As Rome absorbed the Marsi, Angisha became less central. Her worship persisted locally but never achieved wider recognition. Her sanctuary fell to ruin. Rituals were forgotten. By late Roman times, Angisha was vague, her nature lost. Christianization dealt the final blow. Nemetona was a Celtic goddess whose name appears in inscriptions across Gaul and Germania. Her name derives from Nemeton, sacred grove. She was deity of sanctuaries themselves, goddess of places where gods are worshipped. Sacred groves held enormous importance in Celtic religion. Natural temples where boundaries between worlds thinned. Nemetona embodied this sacredness. But as Rome expanded, forests were cleared. Her physical spaces disappeared. When groves vanished, so did need for their goddess. Christianity finished it. These are just a few among countless others. What's remarkable isn't that gods were forgotten, but that any were remembered. Zeus, Athena, Apollo persist because their stories were written, copied, studied. But for every Zeus, dozens almost made it. The difference between remembrance and oblivion came down to historical accidents. These forgotten gods remind us memory requires work, intention, repetition. Stories must be retold. When that work stops, forgetting begins. And perhaps that's oddly comforting. The reminder that even gods depend on mortal care. That memory is an act of love. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine a quiet temple in the hills, long abandoned, altar covered in moss. Perhaps a traveler passed once and said the name aloud, giving that forgotten god one last moment of recognition. The gods we've visited are gone, or nearly so. But here, for moments, we've spoken their names again. And in that remembering, however brief, they flicker back. Not as they were, but as echoes. Gentle whispers in the dark. Stories told once more before night takes everything.